Hey, what's up, guys? Long time no see. It's been busy. It's been really crazy. Sorry that I've been away for just a little bit, about a week or so. Had a couple, oh my God, had a couple tests actually. Had a respiratory test and then I had a medical, yeah, my cat, had a medical legal test, actually just today. And so passed both of them, pretty good. And so then, now I have my term final next week, and then after that I got 3 more semesters left, and then I'll be done. But yeah, so it's just been pretty hectic. I got all the notes down for this lecture, and then I'm gonna start doing some more notes on the next lecture, and then I saw your assignments, so I'm gonna go get those graded. I do have, I believe, not too many left. I think maybe like 7 more, five or 7 more, and then after that, we'll be going on to the next assignment, which is due, I believe, next week. But otherwise, that is about it, really. It's just going to be pretty hectic. I'm going to try to do this lecture, and then tomorrow's my dad's birthday, and so I might not be around. But then I will try to get the next lecture in on Sunday. Even though that is a Super Bowl, I know you guys will probably be away, but that's fine. I'll just try to get that uploaded quickly so I could be good for next week because I'll be studying a lot for that term exam. And so, besides that, some quick things. And so, with this lecture, I'm also going to talk about the paper and kind of like how to do citations. And so, it was brought up to me that I guess citations aren't really something that a whole lot of people have learned in like high school or even freshman year of college and stuff like that. It's not really taught as much. Correct me if I'm wrong, but even last semester when it was brought up to me, I was told that not too many people talk about it or have learned about it. And so I'll teach you how to do footnotes, and then I'll also, well, at least I'll point you in the right direction, how to do footnotes, and then how to cite sources in a formal paper. So for this paper, you could pick one book, you could pick one source, just kind of get your feet wet with that. And then when it comes to the midterm, that's when we kind of step it up a little bit more. But essentially, that is about it. And so I got my cat. My cat's right here. And so he's going to be hanging out with us. And then I also have my tea. This is tangerine. It's not a sweet tangerine. That's what it is. It's not really sweet, but it's very tangerine-y. And then, so yeah, this era, 1920s into the 30s, this one, sure, you got a lot of the, like the roaring 20s and stuff like that, but you also got a lot of discourse. This is kind of when the social aspect comes into play here, and a lot of the times it's going to be racial, and then a little bit of political, but most of it's going to be racial in this era. And it's a lot of discourse, a lot of violence, a lot of gruesome stuff I'm going to be talking about, and that's just the fact of the matter. And so America does have a very dark past, and I'm going to explain that here in a bit. And so a lot of this is going to be subjective. I believe that's the one where it's pretty much, this is what the facts are, and this is what I got from a lot of the sources, and then a couple books. There's one book that I told you guys that you can get if you want to. There's Slavery by Another Name, and so this one's by Douglas A. Blackman, and then that one mainly talks about how a lot of the slaves that came from the Civil War, they're now free, but they also are not really free at the same time. A lot of the Southern whites start to exploit the fact that they're not educated, they don't know how to read, they don't know how to do a lot of things, and so they use that to their advantage and kind of bring the freedmen back into the system. You have a lot of this, they coined the term neo-slavery, kinda, and so that's a lot of that in that book. But then also a lot of the stuff that I pulled from is going to be coming from American Midnight. So American Midnight, I don't think is a book that I told you guys to get, but it's a great book. Very, very gruesome stuff. And then Adam Hochschild, he comes at it from more so I want to say he's more on par with Max Hastings. So Max Hastings, he does a really good job with telling stories from a kind of like a first-hand point of view. Even though even though he's not there, he's talking about it from the people who were. So he's taking a lot of first-hand accounts. And then he's also taking stuff from additional historians just to formulate this story of the American Midnight, which is essentially um, the global war, which then goes into a domestic war, and then how all this pretty much culminates into what we now know as World War II. But then, well, into the Great Depression and then World War II after that. But this is basically how America became what it was into the 30s, 40s, and then into the civil rights. This is pretty much where the civil rights kind of like starts essentially. And so the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, you get a lot of like boycotts and then a lot of racial tension, but some violence, but most of it's going to be protests, walks, strikes, sit-ins, stuff like that. This, on the other hand, the 20s, there was a lot of just straight up violence, just straight up fisticuffs, just hand to hand combat, shootings, drive-bys, like buildings getting set on fire, explosions or bombs and stuff like that. So, um, so yeah, it's a lot of violence, but hey, fact of the matter is, it happened, and it is unfortunate that America's basis stems from all this hatred, and it is something that we just have to learn, and we have to grow, and we have to understand that it is wrong, but it is our history. And I know it's not something that not too many people learn about it in schools, but so that's why I'm explaining to you guys now. So then when you do go into your junior, senior, or sophomore year, even freshman year, then you know about this stuff. And you can look it up on your own too, look up this stuff. And so it's gruesome. There's a lot of gruesome pictures, so I will say that it may trigger some of you, but like I said, that is America. When you pull back the curtain, that's what you see. And so I'll leave off at that point, and I do apologize as well because I did forget to talk about the aircraft. And so when I'm talking about these things, I'm trying to formulate this story that will culminate into World War II and then into the contemporary era post 1945. And a lot of this stuff kind of takes part in that, but I didn't explain it. And so now I'm going to start off with that, and then I'm going to move into the 20s. And so it will honestly begin with the Wright brothers. So Wright brothers, they were born in, like 1870s? I want to say they were born in the 1870s. Correct me if I'm wrong. But 1892, they built the bike shop, which is only like maybe 20, 30 minutes from here, downtown in Dayton. And from there, about 10 years later after that, they started experimenting with this theory of wing warping. And so they started using, these bicycle systems or like bicycle materials. They took fabric and like cables and for like the spokes and tires for the bikes, and they started creating these gliders, and then they built these giant wind tunnels, and they started experimenting with flight or with how to sustain flight essentially. And so all this stemmed from, I believe, back in 1880, I want to say, around there, where they actually had a little toy helicopter, and so they were kind of figuring out how it sustained flight. And so then, 1903, after they finally figured out the right, pun intended, the right mechanical structure of the aircraft, that's when they took it to Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, completely private. and ultimately they finally were able to get it off the ground. So I believe at the first flight was with, I think it was with Orville. Orville flew 120 feet, and then Wilbur flew the 850 feet one. And so then after that, it was in private, and so not a whole lot of people knew about it. And then after that, they started going on a tour once word got out that they actually created an aircraft that could sustain flight. So then they took the aircraft to France. And so that was in about what, 1908, I want to say. But up until then, they created two more aircraft, the Wright Flyer 2 and 3. And then that was in 1904 and 1905. And then the following year, they started creating this system to where they can actually pull a cord, which will literally warp the wing. And then the plane would actually, so that's what you call your flaps, I believe, or your aileron, the aileron system. But this is more so a warped wing system. So where if you want to turn a certain way, the wings are going to, the cables stretch and pull the wings. So then that means the wings kind of tip like that. So then you're able to turn and then turn left, turn right, and then go up, go down. And so they finally they perfected it. And so in 1908, they took it out to France, and then they did this demonstration. And then this man by the name of Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, and he ended up getting into the aircraft, I believe, with Orville. And then they did a couple laps, but then finally the propeller actually shredded, I believe it shredded a cable, which actually put the aircraft into a uncontrolled dive. And they went straight for the ground. Orville actually got pretty badly injured, but he ended up making it alive. But Thomas Selfridge, he ended up becoming the first person to die from an aircraft. And so there's this other guy by the name of Glenn Curtis. Glenn Curtis, he was born in New York, and he was a motorcycle racer enthusiast. He was an enthusiast of motorcycles. He actually raced motorcycles, I believe. And then he started hearing about Orville and Wilbur Wright, and then the aircraft, and then he got into the aeronautical system, the aeronautical business. And then after that, he created his aircraft in 1906, and then he created the aileron system. And so then, by that point, that's when he started getting into trouble. And so 1908, he created the June Bug. And so the June Bug was technically the first aircraft to publicly sustain flight in the United States. And so just take note that Orville and Wilbur Wright were the first to sustain flight in an aircraft, but it was a glider. This one in the United States. The June Bug was a powered aircraft. And that was kind of like a small little distinction that they had. And so he had perfected the aileron system. So this system was, instead of pulling cords, which actually pulled the wings, he had a full set of wings in the front, or a full set of flaps in the front, and then on the sides. So that way, all he had to do was just twist a wheel, and the cables actually pulled the flaps on either side, or the ailerons on either side, and so that would tip the plane, so he could bank the plane, he could pull up the plane, and he could also, I believe, yaw. I believe that's what it's called. And so I am very rusty when it comes to aircraft knowledge, because the last time I had worked at the museum, the Air Force Museum, was back in November, right before I started paramedic school. And so it's been a while since I've talked about these aircraft, but now that I'm talking about it, it's starting to slowly come back. And so by 1908 to 1909, Wright brothers, they caught wind of this. And so they took Glenn Curtis to court, and then over the fact that he took their idea of the aileron system. And so technically they created the system, But then in court, he had mentioned, well, Glenn Curtis had mentioned that, yeah, sure, they created it, but he just made it better. And then that was kind of like that was actually a quote that he said. There was a book a while ago on Glenn Curtis, and then they had talked about being in court, and then I guess they had explained how he took their idea of the aileron system, and then he was, and I quote, "I didn't take your idea, I just made it better," or something like that. And so, yeah, ultimately he lost the case, but that is just goes to say that by 1909 he was unable to manufacture aircraft. The Army actually purchased the Wright Flyer and created the 1909 military flyer. And by 1917, which was the end of World War, well, when the U.S. entered World War One, the U.S. government called for the manufacturing of aircraft to get into this war. And so by this time as well, the June bug was being looked at by the Navy because the Navy was trying to figure out a way to have aircraft take off from the sea and also from an aircraft carrier or another ship. And so it's funny because then by 1917, the U.S. government created this like manufacturers group, or it's called like the I guess it was called kind of like the manufacturers aircraft pool. And so this was basically all the funds went into this pool, and any aircraft manufacturer had access to this pool to make aircraft. Well, most of the proceeds actually ended up going to Curtis, who jumped on the opportunity, and the Wright brothers, who also jumped on the opportunity. And then ultimately, the Navy ended up picking the June bug, and he started manufacturing sea aircraft, Glenn Curtis, while the Wright brothers started manufacturing aircraft for the Army. So that's where you kind of get this Army and Navy distinction moving forward. So then, another thing too, by this point, Billy Mitchell is a strong advocate for aircraft by this point. And so he goes on to say that, hey, we can sustain flight, we can sustain a victory by the use of strategic bombing or by the use of bomber aircraft. And so that is what changed the war in World War One. And a lot of other military officials pointed towards battleships. And so there's this book called it's by Alfred T. Mahan, and around this time actually, Alfred T. Mahan this book became like one of the best selling books and the most used book in military theory. And so it had to do, I believe. So I forgot the title of the book, but I know for sure once I end this lecture, it's going to come back to me. But essentially, his theory was that naval ships can curtail war if a navy takes over the logistical aspect of a foreign nation. And so if you're able to control trade routes, if you're able to control ports, you can cause another nation to topple logistically. So because of that, because if a foreign power goes to war, it needs a certain level of both money, soldiers, resources. And so if it doesn't have resources, it can't get money. If it doesn't have either of those, it can't sustain an army. It needs all of those to work together in unison. And with a strong navy who can block trade and can block import and export of resources, there you go. A foreign nation can't produce or can't sustain a large navy or a large military. And so that was kind of his way of, or that was his book, his theory, and that was adopted by plenty of nations. By this point, also Japan and Britain were the main ones taking that. But also that book was widespread used by both Germany and Britain and Germany and the U.S. and nations like that. And so, yeah, so that's kind of like the story military-wise of, how everything's going to kind of culminate into the 30s and then finally the 40s with pretty much wide scale war. And so here we come to 1918. So 19. I'm gonna shut this down for a little bit. So 1918, it's the end of the war essentially, and well, the war kind of starts to come to a close, and um, that's when you get a lot of veterans who come home. Black veterans start going back to the South. White veterans going back to the North and the West, and also the South as well. And so then when they come back, things are different. And they have a lot of, there's German immigrants in there now. And so then you also have black Americans who come back to the South, but many of their friends and colleagues are gone. Well, they didn't know that at this point in time, the first Great Migration already happened. So a lot of black Americans are already in the North, in the West, and everything. And so also, by this point as well, when these black Americans moved to the South, they started to undergo extreme prejudices, and so this was different than what they were promised, and so the 1920s were considered the progressive era, or the era of a new beginning, essentially. And so also, because of the Russian Revolution and the rise of the Bolsheviks, there was another thing that the U.S. was extremely worried about, was the influx of immigrants into the United States, especially people um, who were what's the word? People who were influenced by kind of like the communist leadership, or like the socialist movement. And so now you get the IWW and then the Socialist Party, and both of them, they started to push out black members, and then the Wilson and the Woodrow Wilson, that the administration started to actually appease federal workers, and then they wanted to resegregate the jobs just to make them happy, to keep them working. And then the Southern government, as well, or local governments, and they became overrun by openly racial people, or racist people. And then most of the time, it is the South was heavily Democratic, and then it was heavily Republican in the North. So then when it came time to vote, the most of the black Americans wanted to vote Republican because they associated that with Lincoln, who was Republican, of course. And so, not of course, but like he was Republican as well, as plenty of you know. And so the South believed that was a risk to democracy, so they started to actually go on a widespread, what do you call that? Like, basically, they started to arrest as many blacks as they could who were attempting to vote in the North and the West. And so by doing so, they started to arrest them under the notion that they cannot vote legally because they are not voting in the state that they are from. And so the Justice Department were the people who started sending agents out to take them. And so that was kind of like 1918 into 1919 and everything. And so by that time as well, you also get these people called the Knights of Liberty. And so the Knights of Liberty were these industrial workers. So the industrial workers of the world were the IWW. And so they were kind of like a revolutionary labor union. And so by this time also, you get a lot of unions who started to pop up as well. And they all unite under the fact that the working class are being held down by the elites, and so they want to take down capitalism. Capitalism is the enemy. They thought that capitalism was the reason why they weren't experiencing the American dream, which was to become more prosperous and amongst everyone else. And so a lot of these people who were under this labor union, they were, taken, whipped, like tarred and feathered, stuff like that. And so the people who did that were called the Knights of Liberty. So the Knights of Liberty were essentially like this anti-union group who were, some of them were actually part of the government as well, and so they were the ones who were trying to go out and attack all these unions, labor unions. Oh, come on up here. He's coming. There he is. And so, now I'm gonna put this down. A lot of this also ends up with the anti-Semitic behavior. And so Henry James, who was a novelist at that point, he... Oh, what are you doing? Stop. What? So, Henry James, he was essentially a novelist who talked about, in New York City, who talked about how the Jews swarmed New York with like worms after a rainstorm. And by that time as well, another Emma Goldman, who I mentioned earlier in the World War One lecture, or the, I guess, 1900 to 1914 lecture, and she led an 8,000 person protest, and especially because of the draft. So the draft was still instituted by this point, and so people didn't like that. They wanted to get rid of that. So then she started this protest, and then you also got these labor unions, and then you also got anti-Semitic people as well. And so then by this point, you also get undercover police. And so the government knew that there was a lot of people who were sentimental to unions and socialist behavior. You also got Emma Goldman leading an 8,000 person protest on the draft, who was also a feminist and an anarchist, openly anarchist. You got Henry James with anti-Semitic notions, and then that's when the government's like, we got to do something. So then they send in undercover agents. And so they started to arrest different people under conspiracy to corrupt. And so finally, Emma Goldman was arrested, and so she was sent to 2 years in jail, and then she received a $10,000 fine. And by this time, Woodrow Wilson started to believe that even though the war has ended, now it's coming back to the United States. So you're going to have, even though you had war abroad, now he's going to have war at home. So now, this is where we get to the meat and veggies, essentially. And so by this point, not only do you have African Americans who are now being targeted by the South, you also got African Americans who were being targeted by the North for taking labor workers' jobs. You also got people out west who didn't want them to take their jobs as well. So you got this one race who they could not live in the South because of violence. They couldn't live in the North because of the job market. And then same thing out west. So then this is where things kind of boil over, because you got this one racial group who essentially they became so mad that things started to boil over to where now there's full-scale violence. And that's where we get to the East St. Louis riots. And so these riots, basically it started because it's feared retaliation, and then all these armed groups of men formed. And so finally, this was these black neighborhoods. And so finally, one time, this Model T, it's a Ford, and so the Model T drove through a black neighborhood and started opening fire on them. And so This Model T was filled with a bunch of people who were upset that these, black men or black men, women, were taking their jobs. And now, this obviously upset these black neighborhoods, and so finally the black neighborhood, they armed themselves, and so they waited for the next go round. So then finally another Ford came through, and they opened fire on this Model T, and then they killed both occupants, but these occupants were actually police officers. That's not good. So then the National Guard, they were called out to put down this insurrection, essentially, but they did nothing. And so this white mob came, and so they took this one black man, and then they hung him with a clothesline, with four others lay dying at his feet. And then after they hung him, they beat him, pulled him down, beat him some more, and then they fired on him, and they dragged him through the street, and then he was set on fire. And then all the residents, they were pulled out of their homes, or some of them were pulled out of their homes, and so finally this mob started setting fire to this black neighborhood, and then they kept all the fire engines outside of the town, but also they kept all the residents in, all the black residents in. And so then you get these instances of women and children being beaten and thrown back into the fire, babies being thrown back into the fire. This man, this African American male, was hiding in this like wooden box, and then finally a group of whites saw him, and then they pushed him back in, nailed it shut, and then they threw it back into a fire. And so you get a lot of horrible acts just like that. And then this was basically overnight. So now this novelist, I believe, or poet, I believe, by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois, he documented what happened. And so then finally he made a voice for himself, and he rose up and led a march, a civil rights march of 8,000 African Americans. And so then by this point, Woodrow Wilson was not persuaded to to charge these civilians and soldiers with violence, with murder, stuff like that. So actually all this just went by the wayside, and all of it was just pretty much forgotten amongst the white Americans. And so W.E.B. Du Bois, he made a notion saying, you came back from fighting, so now you fight for yourselves, essentially. In hindsight, he's saying, you're going to have to fight for your civil liberties. You're going to have to fight for all this. And that's essentially what happened. And so now, the black Americans who were drafted were put into segregated units, essentially. So when they were back over in the war, they were in segregated units. Now, they still experienced racial violence over there. So then coming back, they're experiencing the same thing. And so I believe there's one instance where over in Europe, 3 black men were hung for reportedly rape, and then all 3,000 black men that were in that barracks, in that unit, were forced to watch, and they were held at gunpoint the whole entire time. And then by this point as well, on the opposite end, you got the IWW. There was this mass arrest of IWW organizers, and this guy infiltrated that. He was known as 836, which was like Leo Wendell. So you can look him up and do some more info on him. But basically, Leo Wendell, he was an informant through the I believe the FBI. He was a federal informant who infiltrated this leftist socialist group, and he ended up exposing their plan to basically sabotage the agricultural industry and topple the capitalist world, basically. And so, by this point, there's growing support over domestic enemies, especially over German immigrants. And so black Americans and empowered women and everything. So now you got these white Americans, these elite white Americans, and then you also got the working class white Americans versus um, black Americans and also women. And so this woman by the name of Kate O'Hare, is also called Red Kate. She was also a socialist as well, and so Socialist Party activist who was also a school teacher. And so she was also a journalist, and so then because of that, she was a candidate for the U.S. Senate in 1916, but also she was arrested at this point in time for her speeches against the war effort and stuff like that. So there's some wide scale raids by this point, and then by the summer of 1919, you got these like 500,000, I believe, yeah, 500,000 blacks. They are now in the North and the West. So there's another massive migration of black veterans. And so they didn't want to submit to this domestic tradition of, sharecropping and, being part of the system and all that and working under these white Americans who were basically using them for their own profit. And so they wanted to make a name for themselves. And so then between 1918 and 1919, you got 145 black Americans who were killed. They were all hung. And so by that summer, there's rumors of a white American or white woman who was possibly assaulted. This sparked widespread mobs of white Americans in Chicago. So now you got the Chicago riot. There's a bunch of white veterans and sailors of that time period, and they all led these mobs into these Chicago black neighborhoods. And then by doing so, the black Americans started rising up and created their own mob. And so then this mob rose up in defense and then attacked at random. So now anyone who was white, they just attacked them. And so another guy by the name of John Mills. And John Mills, he was an African American veteran who stood up, who was stoned to death outside of, I believe it might have been outside of his home or something. But yeah, he was stoned to death, and he was only 34 years old. And so after days and days of just attacking each other, about 40 people died. And so finally, by that point, Woodrow Wilson then marched his soldiers into Chicago and put it under martial law. And then by that point as well, 2 pipe bombs went off. And so this was in Pennsylvania, though. So one of these, though, was by the socialist. Well, both of them were by the socialist IWW group. But this explosion occurred in D.C. in a neighborhood where, like, just 5 minutes away, where FDR, Howard Taft, Warren Harding, and Dwight Eisenhower all lived close by to this vicinity. And so the blast destroyed Warren Harding's first level of his home. It completely destroyed the whole entire structure of it. But the top floor is where they were at. And so just minutes earlier, they were downstairs. But then finally, once they all went upstairs, especially his 10-year-old daughter, the whole bottom floor was leveled. And so not Harding, but Palmer. And so this guy, what's his name? Oh, I do not have his name down. But essentially, yeah, so by doing so, Palmer led this domestic war. And so he wanted to figure out who did this. So he led this massive influx of finding out who did this. So he led this domestic war against the IWW. And so there's these another group of workers who created this other faction called the APL, or I believe it's the American Protection League. And so just to combat the IWW, now America has the APL to fight and arrest these socialist groups. And so Palmer ended up leading out this mass arrest of like 61 or so men. And then by doing so, where are you going? Shoot, my notes are so convoluted with stuff. There's so much stuff to get through. So yeah, and so by this point in time, after those 60-some people were arrested, then you get these laws under Woodrow Wilson, these laws against immigration and stuff like that. So now immigration is more strict. You're pushing out these German immigrants. You're pushing out Russian immigrants, Jewish immigrants, Irish, things like that. And so by 1919, you still got this influx of violence. I believe a sharecropper was then killed by a white police officer was killed by a disgruntled black sharecropper. So then 500 soldiers then marched into the town of Elaine. I believe it's a town. It might be a city. But the town of Elaine, and killed up to about 200 black Americans. So this was just straight up just a massacre. And because no one understood how much people who died, because they had thrown most of them into the Mississippi River. And so then, by this point, because of all this civil unrest and because of this murder, you get 24 other cities who experienced riots and racial violence. And then by 1920, about 300 to 400 blacks were murdered just in cold blood. And then these riots grew more and more. And then the fact of the matter is that none of these riots gained any publicity at all. And so that was the issue, especially with America at that point in time, is that most of the time you get a lot of documentation on like the Wright brothers, Glenn Curtis, or the theory of aviation, or the aviation race in America, and the development of the aircraft carrier, and all these great things that come about, jazz and swing, and all these innovations and firsts came up. But when it comes to these riots and all these murders, none of it goes into the newspaper. I mean, it does go into the newspaper, but none of it reaches the front page, really. And so, I mean, not to say it didn't, but it's just not something that a lot of people now will really know about unless they do some deep diving. And so, there's this place called Tulsa, Oklahoma. So a lot of people some people may know what I'm getting to. Tulsa, Oklahoma was basically Black Wall Street. So think of Wall Street, but slightly bigger. And so this whole entire town was a growing, vibrant city, with most of the population being Black American. What are you doing? And so about 2,000 of this city, they ended up being, they ended up being part of this giant, vibrant city where a lot of businesses were black owned. And so you also got, like a black owned library. You also had, a lot of businesses, newspapers that were black owned. And so the city was just blowing up. But also, you got a lot of violence. So violence started to really grow. And there was like a white taxi driver who was lynched after um, being attacked by a white mob, you know? And then you got Dick Rowland. So now, this is where I'm going to get into the story of the massacre, essentially. So this whole entire city was leveled within a night. So, Dick Rowland, he ended up entering an elevator, a black American, middle-aged guy, and so he entered this elevator, accidentally stepped on this lady's foot. This lady by the name of Sarah Page. Sarah Page screamed, and she ended up being confided in by law enforcement. She went to the law enforcement and actually told him, or told them, that he attempted to rape her. And so he was, of course, arrested, and essentially there was a mob, a white mob that gathered outside of the courthouse. Well, the sheriffs were protecting him, and they were trying to keep the mob at bay. And then finally, 25 men from a black mob, or black American vets, who formed this little group. 25 of them went to the courthouse, and then they offered to defend the courthouse, but then the sheriffs turned them away. And so they went back, and the mob turned away from the. They brought in the National Guard, and then the mob went to the armory. Well, sorry. The mob went to the armory to get weapons to go back to the courthouse, but then the National Guard turned them away. So then by this point, it's like 10 p.m. at night. And then there's a rumor that came out that the mob was at the courthouse. And so 75 vets went back to the courthouse. The black American vets went back to the courthouse, and they came to defend it, but they were also denied again. And so then when they were walking back, a white citizen tried disarming one of these black veterans, and then a shot accidentally went off. Nobody was killed at that point, but the fact of the matter is that a shot went off. That's not good. So then from 10 p.m. till roughly, 10, 11, 12? So I want to say like 4 a.m. Yeah. 10 p.m. till 4 a.m. You then get this massive influx of hand-to-hand fighting along like the railroad system. You also get drive-by shootings. Then you also get fires that were set amongst the whole entire commercial district, and local authorities started to deputize actually mob members and then give them a gun. And so then there's a term that they were quoted. And so I'm not going to actually say it, but they said, get a gun and then get a, you know what. That was the slogan that they had. And so then the National Guard came in, and all they did was protect white neighborhoods from all this that was going on. They didn't go in and try to break up anything. And so then by daybreak, pretty much every single white American who surrounded Tulsa invaded it. And so now you get widespread violence, widespread panic. Families are trying to leave. And you got machine guns that were being used, possibly even aircraft. There was some evidence or some people who were saying that aircraft were being used above the streets of Tulsa. And so by this time, by daybreak, about 300 black Americans were dead, and another 10,000 ended up being homeless. And the city was completely leveled, and then anybody who was dead were thrown into mass graves by that point. And then the city was rebuilt. It took them time, but ultimately the city was rebuilt, but it never regained that same prosperity that it did right before. So, with this happening in America by this point, I'm going to move over to Germany by this point as well. 1917, 1918, the end of the war happens. Treaty of Versailles happens. Well, 1919, Treaty of Versailles happens. And so then this guy by the name of Adolf Hitler, and he is very disgruntled. He was a soldier in the German army, and he proclaimed that it was the Jewish government that undermined the German people and attempted to cause the German people to lose the war, which ultimately it did. And so he, by 1921, created the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and then which ultimately became the Nazi Party. And so also by this time, Billy Mitchell. So Billy Mitchell, by this time, he takes the MB-2 bomber, which is also at the Air Force Museum. Great, massive bomber. But he also strapped, I believe it's like 1,000-pound bomb to it. And there's a video also of his idea that the Navy is useless with an Air Force to attack it, because a bomber can sink a ship with one bomb. And so he takes the SMS Ostfriesland, and so it's a German battleship of World War One, a captured German battleship, and of course he sinks it with one bomb. And so he successfully demonstrates that a bomber can sink a battleship, and that a battleship is not immune to a onslaught of aircraft. But he doesn't really successfully bring America to that theory, which I will explain later on with the 1925. And so by this time, you also get 1922, 1923, even though you still get racial violence, you also get, just to lighten the situation a little bit more, you also get these other things that are happening, like Annie Oakley's still around, and she still makes people, or shows people, that she is one of the best Marx women of that time period. She, I believe, at a festival, or like some kind of Western festival, she ended up shooting 100 clay pigeons back to back to back. And then Walt Disney, he creates the Laugh-O-Gram, which unfortunately goes bankrupt, but then also sets the precedence for then Disney. And then you also get widespread usage of the radio, which also becomes something of the matter when it comes to World War II. And then Time magazine releases its first official issue with, I believe, Woodrow Wilson as the person on the cover, I want to say. And then pension laws start coming around, which sets the stage for Social Security by this point as well. So you get a lot of, these firsts and innovations, and, kind of these nice, cool events that are going on. But also not so super cool as well. By 1923, the KKK now reach 1 million members. This is kind of the height of the Ku Klux Klan and violence against Black Americans by this time as well. Warren Harding, by this point, I believe he becomes president as well. He pulls U.S. troops out of Germany. So now Germany, this is the last time that... no, not the last time, but this is the last of kind of like that reconstruction in Europe. So this is the end of that. And then by this point as well, the first aerial refueling happens between Captain Lowell Smith and Lieutenant John Richter. And then shortly after that, Harding ends up passing away of a heart attack, and then Calvin Coolidge then becomes a president after that. 1924. So 1924, not only do you get an influx of people who are against, well, not against, but they are anti-Semitic, against Black Americans. You also get labor unions who are against capitalism. Now you got America who is against Asian immigrants. So now, Asian exclusion starts to become a large, wide-scale thing with the passing of the Asian Exclusion Act. So this banned all Asian immigrants to the U.S. This also now sets the precedence for possibly the relations between Japan and America. because now you get this growing animosity towards Asian Americans. And then this also curtails in another instance where the U.S. executes a Chinese soldier by gas chamber. So this is the first, not the first use, but the first usage of a wartime, like a war, first usage of the gas chamber being used for execution, essentially. And so this kind of like starts making people kind of aware of like capital punishment. Is it good? Is it bad? So this kind of raises some awareness about that. But you also get a lot of black Americans who innovated stuff like, so by 1924, Garrett Morgan, he creates, or he updates the traffic signal. Alice Parker creates the first gas furnace. So a lot of your gas furnaces, she created that. James S. Adams, who a lot of these aircraft nowadays, well, even though they're jet engines, a lot of your propeller-driven aircraft are powered by propellers that were essentially made by him. He created the modern aircraft propeller, or he invented a less restrictive, better airflow propeller. And so by 1925, you get the Roaring Twenties. So this is essentially this massive progressive influx of like jazz, and then swing dancing, and then you also get widespread usage of, kind of like entertainment in the homes. Music becomes like the best thing, the big thing on the block, and then that's when tragedy kind of strikes too. So 7 naval destroyers end up sinking outside of the coast of California at Honda Point. This is the worst naval disaster domestically in American history. So this is like 1924, 1925. 1925 by this point as well, the tri-state tornado rips through, I believe, like 3 states in Tornado Alley. I believe it's, I want to say Illinois, I want to say Mississippi, and oh shoot, I forgot the last one. Maybe Montana, I want to say. Well, it's right here actually. So Illinois, rips through Illinois, and then where is it? And then you also got Mississippi, and then Tennessee. That's where it is. So rips through all of those states, and then where is it? Oh yeah, so 700 people are killed. It becomes a massive thing in the newspaper, and then by this point as well, with the military side, Billy Mitchell is court-martialed, and so he makes a statement that the U.S. neglected air power for battleships, and he's going against what America wants. And so then he's finally court-martialed, stripped of his rank, and he kind of falls by the wayside. And then by this point as well, Hitler's Mein Kampf comes out. And so Hitler is jailed for the beer hall putsch. And so essentially he wants to overthrow the government and take over the government by this point. And so he forms this coup, and then finally he is arrested. He's wounded, then arrested, and then he writes Mein Kampf, and then it's My Struggle. And this becomes widespread, bestseller in Germany, and essentially it highlights his idea, his fascist ideology, and he actually takes the fascist idea from Benito Mussolini, who creates the idea of fascism in Italy. So now you got Benito Mussolini, who's rising to fame in Italy under the same kind of ideology as Hitler is doing in Germany. By this point in time in the U.S., the first liquid-fueled rocket is developed. And so now this is kind of like an evolutionary step in rocketry, moving into the 1930s and the 40s as well. And so then also John Scopes. So John Scopes, he's arrested for teaching evolution. And so up to this point, a lot of people are fairly religious, and then this guy comes in and teaches the idea that evolution is how we came about, not so much the Garden of Eden and stuff like that. So now you get not only the social unrest, but also international or global unrest with the rise of fascism in or Italy or in Europe and stuff like that. But you also get the war between religion and science by this point as well. And so after that, 1927, the FCC starts regulating things. And so by this point, radio is widespread. You can listen to anything on the radio, but then the FCC starts to regulate that. And then aircraft starts to become more of a thing. And so I believe the first monoplane was created by this point as well, about 1926, 1927. Don't correct me if I'm wrong. We also got the P-26 around that point as well, I want to say. But yeah, the first monoplanes start popping up around the 1920s, and then Pan American is a leading civilian airline. So then by this point, they become really popular. Natural disasters start to happen more widespread, but this also raises awareness about disaster relief in the U.S. The Great Mississippi Flood left 650,000 people homeless. It also left thousands and thousands dead. I want to say, and it started setting a precedence for American disaster response and how it's flawed. By 1928, you get this idea of capital punishment. So capital punishment becomes a thing of discussion because this point, a woman by the name of Ruth Snyder, who was, I believe, she might have been I know she murdered someone, but I can't remember if she was a serial killer. But essentially, she was slated for execution by electric chair. Someone snuck in the camera and took a picture at the moment that she was executed. It got sent into the newspaper, and then there you go. This is the first time people have seen an execution happen. And so now they're like, is execution like morally right? No, like, because it was gruesome. I think you can see the pictures online too. It was pretty gruesome. So then another another kind of disaster, the St. Francis Dam. It breaks overnight. Towns were flooded. About 400 people died. It caused about $7 million in damage. And then also you got, what was it? The St. Valentine's Day Massacre by Al Capone, who killed about, 7 mobsters, mob members, or gang members in cold blood. And then, you got all these horrible things that are happening in America in the 20s. And then you get October 29th, Black Tuesday. And so all this stuff was happening throughout the 1920s, all these horrible things. And then finally, once things started kind of coming together, racial tensions were still high. And then I believe after, I want to say 1922, 1923, you do get the Ku Klux Klan, who sent in about 40,000 members who marched on D.C. It was, I believe, the largest Ku Klux Klan march to date, I want to say. And now you get Black Tuesday. So by this point, you got an influx of purchasing. And so I believe around this time too, you got the introduction of credit. And so people are able to put things on credit. And, I believe that might have been earlier, but I want to say it was. And so the idea was that people were able to... Am I getting this wrong? I am getting this wrong. Because the first one was about credit. So this one was about stocks. So with stocks, the more you buy in, the more it starts to rise, of course. But then, the more it rises, the higher the cost. The higher the cost, the more people have to pay in to get a share. Well, at some point, they can't really. A large influx of people can't really pay for these shares. So then, of course, the stock market officially just collapses. And so 16.5 million shares end up just lost in 24 hours. And so by this Henry Hoover, he's president by this point as well. And he assures the people that this is a fluke. Prominence is going to return. Don't even worry about it. As long as you just keep buying stuff, keep throwing into the economy, you're okay. And so by this time as well, America is at the highest population it's ever been. I believe 116 million by the opening of the 1920s. But then by 1929, you're sitting at 123 million people. And so now you got this massive influx of people, people without jobs, and then you also got people who are losing their jobs, and then they can't pay for stuff. And so then you got Herbert Hoover, who called for the $150 million like public works program. So this was a way to get people to get more, to open up more job opportunities for people. But then that also called for the use of more money. And so this program was essentially a way to stabilize the economy. And initially it seemed to work, but ultimately it did not. So then by 1930, that's when you get the official start of the Great Depression. So the 1920s into the 1930s, the 1920s was not all that pretty. There was a lot of great stuff that happened. You know, Disney was developed. Norma Jean, she was born and she rises to fame later on. But she's also by another name you guys know of, Marilyn Monroe. You also got this influx of jazz, and so widespread usage of the radio. NBC was developed. Radio frequencies started becoming regulated, but you also get the first use of the rubber tire for the car. Ford, they throw out, I believe, the 15,000th Model T, but then they also developed the Model A that in the 1920s as well. So you get a lot of great things, but you also get a lot of violence. And so that's why I explained all this stuff. So because all this stuff, it may seem convoluted, but that is what America was, the basis that formed contemporary America. And unfortunately, that is the fact of the matter. So like the Tulsa Massacre, the Chicago riots, the East St. Louis riots. You got the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and socialism in America. You got the fight against capitalism, anarchy, feminism. You also get, I believe this was the beginning of the this 1920s was the rise of 1921, I want to say, was the institution of the 19th Amendment. 19th Amendment was basically women's suffrage, and so women gained the right to vote as well by this point as well. So a lot of cool things, but a lot of hatred and animosity, anti-Semitism, the growing of fascism and Bolshevism getting into America. And so that's what I'm gonna stop there. And so that's basically what it is. Now essentially by next weekend I'll talk about the 1930s and the 1940s, and so it won't be as convoluted. So most of the stuff that I wrote down was mainly like bullet points, just to kind of get the main points across, which essentially it was just all out chaos for 10 years. There's so many things that went well, but a very large amount of it was going bad. And it went from good to bad to worse with the opening of the Great Depression. And so once we get into the 30s and 40s, you start to get both chaos and stability at the same time. Social stability with, now you got segregation, but then you also got kind of this growing notion about, we know what we need to do. We all need to bring the economy together. But you also got widespread global issues arising with Germany's in a recession, but they're also coming out of it with Hitler's rise to power. You also got large influx of military buildup with Japan, Britain, Spain, places like that. And then you also got the growing idea that the government needs to keep America safe. And so people put all their trust in the government. And so you get this notion that the government needs to be the world police, but it doesn't have to be. And so that's when we come to what was it? FDR. So FDR will be the next president, and then he's going to be the one to initiate the New Deal. And so the New Deal is going to officially help America get pulled out of the Great Depression by that point. So otherwise, I'm on the high horse. I'm going to stop there, and so not get into it. And so I do apologize for how convoluted this information was. There was so much information. And I'm sorry that there's a lot, and it was kind of like helter-skelter. There's just so much of it. But the bottom line is that all these tragedies that happened with, like, the Tulsa Massacre, and then what was it, the Great Mississippi Flood, and then all these natural disasters and domestic disasters and massacres and public executions and lynching and protests, riots, stuff like that. It's what forms the basis of social America, or the social aspect of America, honestly, up until this point. And a lot of times you will not hear about the Tulsa Massacre, and I assure you right now, as a freshman or sophomore, after this class, you may not hear about the Tulsa Massacre ever again. And that's unfortunate, because a lot of these things are important. They are important to American history, especially when you see how things are today, and then you're like, why are things the way they are today? Well, if you look at history and how things kind of form, that's what you get. So with that being said, when it comes to your next paper, I do have this Turabian, a manual for writers, and so you can pick it up. You can rent the book, you can buy the book. I do have a link that shows you how to do citations, but essentially I'm going to want this in MLA. And so that's basic format. So I believe last name, first name, and then title of the book in italics. Then you also got page number, if you are citing a certain page, and then you also got the publisher, and then the state it was published in, and then also the year. So fairly simple, but that will be your footnote. But then preceding that, you're also going to want to shorten that. So then now the next footnote after that, if you are citing something, it will be that full footnote, and then after that will be, usually it's the title of the book and then comma page number. And then preceding that, it'll just be title of book, page number, title of book, page number after that. Or actually no, it moves over to I believe it's IBI page number, because IBI will basically mean after that every single source that is cited comes from this book. So that's how I know, like, oh, IBI like 112, IBI like 102, stuff like that. That's all coming from that same source. It is a bit kind of confusing, and so I'll see if I can write down an example for you. So yeah, or not unless I have it. Oh, pen. So actually, I'll do it right here. All right. Yeah, okay, cool. That's a good one. So it'll be. You can feel free to take a picture of this too, or take note on it when you can pause the video and take note. Last name. Sorry. So it'll be. I'll write it this way. Then so that's book title be in italics, and then you also got in parentheses. So city, state, and publisher. Nope, city, state. I'll put it down below. Yeah, I'll put it down below. So you got city, state, publisher, then year. There you go. So that's just one small example. Oh, sorry. And then, of course, page number. Oh, so this is just one example of what it may look like. So feel free to copy that down, or like I said, I do have a link there. If you guys do not have the book, then you can just look at the link, and I'll take a look and see where it is. And I believe it is in the files section, but I'll double check for you. But otherwise, that's essentially how you do it. And then for footnotes, you do that same thing. Actually, no, I believe you do first name, last name, so you switch it. So in the citations page on the works cited, you'll do last name, first name. For footnotes, you do first name, last name, and then everything else is pretty much the same. But then after that, so say you did the same thing, and so it'll be, say you do what, like 2, 3, 4. So oh, excuse me, traditional. I believe it is. I want to double check about that. Yeah. So again, feel free to take a picture of this if you want to, but essentially, you're gonna do the traditional format first, and then after that, you'll do title of the book and then the page number. But then, if you do have citations of the same source that precedes the shorthand version, feel free to just go to IBID page number. And then that essentially says that, oh, when I see that, I'll know that that's actually stemming from the same source. So you don't need to write down the traditional format for every single citation that precedes it. If it's the same source, just do the first time you cite it, or in the footnote, just do traditional format. Then after that, page number, and then, or title of the book, sorry. Title of the book, and then the page number, and then just do IBID page number after that. And so it does take time, and so don't be lazy about it. Don't get discouraged. So I am going to judge it pretty harshly, and so just because I do know that, and you will discover this later on too, that being in the history field and also moving on to history classes, they're going to do a lot of citation grading. And one of the hardest parts of history was citations. I still screw it up from time to time. I still overlook stuff from time to time. Even now, I had to go back into the book and figure out a citation and how to do it. Because it's not something you do every day. And so it's not a skill that you're constantly doing. And so for you guys, I want you to get to that level where now, once you if you're told to write a historical source, you're able to do it and you're able to cite just fine with minimal to no corrections. Now, this first paper, try to do your best, and then I will grade those citations pretty harshly, just putting it ahead of time, just because I know it is very important to know those. And so this first one, don't even worry about it. I hope and pray I don't break anyone's hearts when I say, like, yo, please, this is horrible. I am doing that just because to show you that how important it is to cite sources correctly, because you're going to get into the field later on, or into more courses later on, where you can get flagged for plagiarism if you don't cite a source correctly at all. And so that's just the fact of the matter and how it is. But yeah, so that's just a quick rundown for footnotes and citations. I believe in Google Docs, I don't think there is a way to put in citations. I don't think. There might be, especially if you're doing it on a computer, there might be. I think last year, one of the students came to me and said there is no citation, or there is no footnote block to do citations in. So you may have to do it in Microsoft Word, if anything else. But otherwise, I'll double check that and get back to you guys about it, and then I'll send out an announcement if there is none, and then I'll come up with a different scenario for it. But essentially, yeah, that's the rundown about how to do sources and citations, essentially. And so I'm not looking for too much, just one source, one or two sources, however many you want to do. And just make sure you do a works cited page of your sources. A couple of you already are fairly knowledgeable and really know how to do that. So that's good. And so just works cited page. And then if you're able to do footnotes, go for it. And then even if you don't know what you're doing, please reach out to me before you submit the paper, and I can give you a crash course again on how to do it. I can even write it out for you. Just let me know. I'll help you as much as I can before you turn it in. And so, but like I said, tomorrow's my dad's birthday, but I will be around in the morning in case you want to email me for any questions, or if you have any questions on the subject matter. I got a bunch of books in my personal library down there, and so I can definitely show you some additional source material, or point you in a certain direction. But yeah, essentially that's the 1920s. those are citations. This is my capybara. My cat left me, so now I'm gonna start, cleaning around, and maybe I'll hop on some Battlefield 6 or something. Or I've been playing Where Winds Meet. It's another kind of like, you know, Chinese open world, kind of like PC game that I've been playing. It's pretty cool actually. But otherwise, yeah, I'll be flipping through those video games, and so kind of take the night off, and then go back to studying for my term exam tomorrow, before I go down to celebrate my dad's birthday. Otherwise, yeah, just take care, enjoy your time, enjoy your weekend, and well, actually, yeah, enjoy your weekend. Happy Friday in a little bit. But yeah, that's all I got. If you guys don't have any questions for me, but if you do, just feel free to comment, or send me an email, send me a text message. Just let me know, and then I'll try to help out, or I'll reach out to you guys as fast as I can. Otherwise, just take care, stay frosty, and Bob's your uncle. Have fun.